Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Zachary Giuliano. I'm a junior here at CU. I'm double majoring in international affairs and film production. I'm an aspiring documentarian because I'm full of myself. I'm also an enrollee in the Center for the American West's certificate program, and it's just a privilege to be here right now to talk to you all real quick, and thank you for your patience and sticking around. One final thing to know, this is a personal connection of mine to Vine Deloria Jr. In addition to attending CU, I'm a veteran of the United States military. I served for 9 months in the war in Afghanistan, and I was in the Army for 5.5 years, too long. So I discovered Professor Deloria's message in Custer Died for Your Sins this past spring, as Patty was saying. The biggest problem that my group and I had to face is the fact that none of us are Indians, and we were all white dudes. So with that in mind, we had to take sort of a different tack to the project, but we were fortunate enough to have Professor Deloria's ethos, as well as this sweeping manifesto that basically just screamed to us, don't be afraid, it's very okay to say these things. They absolutely need to be said. As Patty was saying, we had a very simple solution to this. We had about 30 minutes to present, and about 10 minutes of this was set aside right in the middle of the presentation, and we, we titled it, "Four White Guys Quote Vine Deloria Jr." And we intentionally picked some of Professor Deloria's most striking statements within Custer Died for Your Sins, whether they were humorous or just what we found to be factual, about American society and its embarrassing history of injustice towards Indian nations. And until about a week before the presentation, we were really hesitant to do it, and we weren't sure how our entirely white, certainly very liberal class was going to take these statements. And I'm really happy to report that out of the 40 or so classmates, they weren't just receptive, but they laughed a lot of the time, especially at jokes where they were the punchline. Just as Professor Deloria was not a typical academic, my experiences make me an atypical student. I come to CU from a lifestyle that valued bluntness and honesty, and we thrived on dark humor. And were I able, I'd love to let Professor Deloria know that the United States military of his day probably hasn't changed very much from the military life I experienced. Just as an aside, when I was writing this, I pictured him doing what I did when I was in the military, which involved a lot of picking up people's cigarette butts. And I just wondered what he would have to say about that. But Professor Deloria, he masterfully harnessed this blunt and pithy writing and sense of humor with an elegance that I believe few before or since have they've achieved. And his wonderful use of humor, as well as his conversational writing style, and just the frankness in his words, they're not only marks of his intelligence, but of his humanity. And to attend a university which he, both as a student as well as faculty, he clearly saw the value in pushing people out of their intellectual comfort zones. It just makes me so proud to be here. Further, it was inspiring to see how my classmates responded to his message, because it was so well received, I can say that I intend to take his philosophy and his way of approaching situations into my filmmaking career. And as another aside, on my way here, I was talking to a friend of mine. She's very involved in social justice issues on campus, and she also said something to the effect of, well, humor is the only way that you can reach people who are resistant to hearing the truth. And I immediately plugged Custer Died for Your Sins. I was like, you gotta check it out, you're gonna love it. But with that in mind, there's very clearly a merit in getting people to listen to blunt statements about grievances and past wrongdoings, which make them laugh while the attention is called to that issue. And I mean, to say nothing of getting them to change their minds while they're doing it. Professor Deloria showed me how one can be deeply and personally involved in an issue without shrinking from the cold truth. And in fact, one of my primary takeaways from Custer Died for Your Sins is that it's okay and probably even proper to be outraged by the truth. And it's also okay to show the truth as absurd, because it usually is. This way of handling reality and the truth of things, it was sort of my primary coping mechanism when I was in the military. And I'm really not sure how my friends and I could have survived that period of our lives without injecting humor into every ridiculous little thing we had to do, sweeping parking lots and picking cigarette butts and waking up at 5:30 in the morning every day. And there were a lot of times when I was reading Custer Died for Your Sins where the truth was just so flatly stated and such a like punch to the gut that I actually would close the book and just have to think for a while. And it called attention to the fact that if we run from the truth, even if we find it absurd or if we're offended by it, we can't hope to move on with more constructive dialogue. And in the current political and cultural climate, I think Custer Died for Your Sins matters more than ever. But the real question is, how do we get people my age and younger, how do we get them engaged in his message? We live in a post-truth world where emotional response to half-truths and just flat-out falsehoods is more important than presenting facts. And 50 years after its publication, this is where Custer Died for Your Sins can again flip the script. Because rather than focusing on only giving hard facts and data, we can synthesize these with humor to elicit the emotional response that a lot of people just feed into. And why? Probably because humor disarms, and Professor Deloria recognized this, crediting in Custer, he credited comedian Dick Gregory for introducing humor into the conversation of civil rights in the 1960s, which I think rightfully so, and Professor Deloria believed it enabled the mainstream to sympathize with the pain that blacks of that era were going through. And Professor Deloria's use of humor was a conscious decision to ascribe thoughtful accountability to groups while letting them know it's okay to laugh at themselves as the punchline of the joke. During the group presentation, we made an analogy that humor is an effective form of like an emotional iodine scrub. Whether a specific person or a group is actually to blame for wrongdoing, humor can cleanse emotional wounds and pave the way for meaningful discussion. The key is to not make an individual feel like they're being targeted, but instead as a participant in the admittedly very complicated process of assessing the past. So how do we engage young people with Professor Deloria's message? Despite what I see in the media about people my age being like sensitive snowflakes, I see the current crop of young folks, they're as incredibly resilient. They're staring down the barrel of the gun, as it were, and dry satirical and ironic humor, which are all laced in truth. They've proliferated the internet, and they act as a coping mechanism for things ranging from climate change to politics to racial issues. And we can engage simply by using what Professor Deloria used, which is just the truth and to be blunt and just put a little humorous spin on it. And I really believe we can engage a lot of young, bright people that way. Again, we have to ask why, and it's because my generation, we're very cynical, but we also hope for a brighter future. We love satire, which is day by day getting harder and harder to divorce from reality. And where do we go from there? Well, we just be truthful. And rather than hinting at the ridiculousness of the truth, whatever that may be, via satire, the truth represents the next rung, not only on the comedic ladder, but as the societal ladder as well. Young people have driven much of the recent major social movements, such as Black Lives Matter, Me Too, both of which came from and relied on these hard truths to spread their message. And I think if given Professor Deloria's manifesto, ripe with its candidness and its humor, which I find as just dark and strong as a cup of coffee, I can see my generation just running riot with the message. I'm not very eloquent, and I think Professor Deloria was a lot more eloquent than I am, so I'm going to let him conclude this for me. Teasing, this is quoting Custer, teasing was a method of control of social situations by Indian people. Rather than embarrass members of the tribe publicly, people used to tease individuals they considered out of step with the consensus of tribal opinion. In this way, egos were preserved and disputes within the tribe of a personal nature were held to a minimum. Gradually, people learned to anticipate the teasing and began to tease themselves as a means of showing humility and at the same time advocating a course of action they deeply believed in. This method of behavior served to highlight their true virtues and gain them a place of influence in tribal policymaking circles. Thank you all for your time.
So we have a reception that is ready to start, and it seems, I hadn't asked you this before, but Faith, would it be okay to have you, would you be all right about closing our reflections? 'Cause I can't think of anything that would be more right, so thank you so much.
So, again, I'm going to ask you to close your eyes, be with Spirit. And this morning we put up our hand to the red day, the beginning of the red day. And as our grandparents, our kushis and our unkana said, now we put our hand up to the red day ending, going to the west. Ake, wana ampetu dutaki, wana ihanke, hecha yu piaked, wogdaka, ehana oyaka piki, de dekshi ga yu piaked, woksape, we chose ani, wokachniga, iocha kiki, hena, ampetu ate heched iwogda kapi. So on this beautiful day, we've had remembrances of that wonderful medicine of laughter, the teaching, woksapa in our language. Creator, you've given us the W. When we use that W, there are values. And so Dekshi was teaching values all the way through. He was passing what we call a storyteller, oyakapi. He also was we have another word for storyteller, ehana oyakapi, which is when the animals talked. And so he also brought us into that realm in our conversation today. And to think of all the foresight that he had, and again, reaching back to the ancestors, which we all have at hand, if we have that. And we place ourselves in those places that he was. All of that wisdom still exists surrounding us in the center, all the way around, up above, below. And again, we offer up a blessing, a wochekia, we choichake, washtekta, meaning generational energy, that energy that has come into the room today in a remembrance will travel, continue to travel forward for the generations to come. And hena yumashki, we're happy about that. We had remembrances, and we do that to our own circles in our communities. Sometimes we forget, but this is a reminder of how very important it is, because there are many great people out there on the ground that don't get these opportunities, but they're doing the work in the grassroots, in the borderlands. And so today we also offer a prayer for those children that are in places sometimes that are so out of control, and yet they survive. Somehow they survive. The resiliency of spirit that watches over them, and many of you in the room that have overcome those adversity, that makes us wonder, how did we survive the generational trauma, the Holocaust that enveloped us, that we still stand here on this beautiful red day. We live in a time where there are eminent things that are attacking our Mother Earth, and so close this day with a prayer for sending a voice, Hoyawaya, to creation. We all have a divine plan to allow us to recognize that divine plan that is before us. Sometimes we run from it, we are afraid of it. Sometimes we don't recognize it, and sometimes we're not ready. But Creator, give you a lot of thanks today for giving us this time of unity of what we call shkan, the sacred energy that brought us together at this intersect and this place and time that we probably will never be all together at this point in time. We may be in another lifetime, but for that, we give you thanks. And as we close this day, we send this feeling, this energy, this prayer, this hope, this goodness to our children, our grandchildren, as they can feel it as it leaves this room. And those that are in mourning, those, I just received word from one of our young ones that has passed on to the spirit world from MMIW. Send prayers with her. She's listening. And any of your losses, but above all, the joy that has come to us today. We are thankful for that as we partake in the medicine of food. Itakiasi. Wopira. Thank you.
Thank you for being with us. I'm a little bit sad for the people who were not with us in this room, which would be several billion people on the planet. And so if anyone has ideas about how we might pass this on, whether that means some astute use of social media that I have never imagined, or if it's just that we all tell other people how we spent the day, whatever it is, anybody who has thoughts and ideas about how to make this stay in our actions as well as our expressions, then let's do that. If there's anything the law school or the Center of the American West or CNICE can do on that, we want to do it. So thank you so much for your company, and anybody who would like to hear more stories about that incredible visit of Jerry Jeff Walker to your home, right? That left some wreckage, I think, if you entertained that interesting singer. Well, anyway, so there's many more stories that we didn't get to, and we can have those, or we could just absorb it all for now. So anyway, thank you so much, and see you next door there in the